Well, it starts really from birth, really. My father was working at Home Park Mill, Dickinson's Home Park Mill in Kings Langley, and lived in a tied cottage, a fireman's cottage. He was a member of the volunteer fire brigade at Home Park. So you know, it starts with my childhood, really, living about 200 yards from the mill. It was just you know, an ever-present part of your life, and used to go down the mill and into the mill as a child, which would be not allowed today, I don't think. So I knew my way around the place as a child. As I grew up, my father, being in the Works Fire Brigade, I used to go to the local tournaments, and so I was very interested in that. You know. I always wanted to be a fireman. Left school at age 15 without any real qualifications, just an end of term report. And this was in 1957, so jobs weren't that easy, you know. And eventually my father got an interview along at Apsley Mill, and I started in the book department as a trainee bookbinder. Within about 2 months, I was kind of invited to go along and on one of the fire brigade training nights at Apsley to, you know, to see what I thought of it. And well, that's needless to say, you know, I couldn't have wished for anything better at that time. The book department, I was in the book department for 9 years, and I didn't really like it. Some of the jobs could be interesting. You moved around onto different jobs. It was mechanised bookbinding as opposed to the ledgers, you know, where it's all done by hand. But it was a job, and it got me in the Dickinson's Fire Brigade. And looking back, I think probably had I not have been in the volunteer fire brigade, actually, my time there would have been quite unhappy, and I think I probably wouldn't have stayed in the book department for those 9 years. But we'll never know. The family history in Dickinson's goes back to 1862, or possibly earlier, but we can't confirm that. Because in 1862, my great-grandfather was living at number 11 Home Park Cottages and working at Home Park. And then in 1862 my grandfather was born, and that's how we know from his birth certificate that he was born at number 11. Subsequently, my grandfather, Noah Sturman, he worked at the mill. We believe he went there straight from school because he did 51 years, and I've got the certificate, the long service certificate at home. So you know, he must have started as he left school, and retired in 1927. My father, born in 1902, born in number 9 where I was brought up. He, for a short time, it must have been only a few months, left school and went to work at a local bakery confectionery firm. He never told me much about that, but given that he did 51 years, it must have been only a few months, and then he started at Home Park Mill. Sometime between, well, after his father died, because if you lived at the cottages and you retired at Home Park, the 12 workmen's cottages, if you were living there and you retired, you were allowed to live there until death. You know, you weren't asked to move out. So my grandmother stayed on with the tenancy, and I'm not sure the exact date. I've got it somewhere. My father took over the tenancy of number 9 sometime in the 30s, I think it was. And hence, you know, we lived there, and I lived there until I got married anyway. It was, you could almost say that those 12 cottages were like a hamlet, really, you know. There were no fences, you know, the gardens were all open plan, and it was a community in its own right, really. You know. Lots of space, too much gardening, you know. But yeah, a good time, really, you know. And it's, you know, you're looking back and you look back at the mills, they were ever present and you never thought they wouldn't be there. Well, thankfully the cottages are still there. You know.
What was the appeal of the fire brigade? Because I know that you were keen on that. What was it which attracted you to being in the fire brigade?
Well, I mean, simply as a child, I mean, any child is attracted, you know, to fire engines and firemen. And we used to watch you know, when they were training of an evening in the field next to where we lived, between the cottages and the mill. And we were allowed to, you know, they had to push the trailer pump back to the mill, and we'd help with that, and we'd go into the fire station in the mill, you know. So, you know, it was just a part of my childhood, and you know, I just felt I'd like to do that, and later I had the opportunity to do it, you know. So yeah, what can I say? It was I wouldn't call it an ambition, but you're just attracted to it, and you want to do it, and you know. And I got the opportunity, absolutely, and I was more than grateful. You know.
What was the community like? Was it a friendly place to work? Did everyone kind of know each other, or was it?
Yes, yes and no. If you compare actually mills with Home Park, there's a massive difference. I mean, for example, the timekeeping control actually was quite rigid. You had to clock in. If you were a factory worker, you had to clock in. And for some years, I mean, from when I started in 1957, for a considerable number of years, you had 3 minutes. If you clocked in more than 3 minutes late, you lost a quarter of an hour. So what they did, dead on 8 o'clock in the morning, they shut the doors and the gates. So if you weren't through the gate, dead on 8 o'clock, you were locked out for 5 minutes. So consequently, when you got to your room and you clocked in, you would have lost 15 minutes. That was to make sure everybody got in by 8 o'clock and were on their way to their place of work. You got to know, actually, you know, the people on your floor, and maybe the floor above and the floor below, but that was it. I mean, given there were about 4,500 people working at Hempstead when I started there, you know, you were limited to how much you could know about the mill. Whereas Home Park, for example, a smaller mill, 300 people working there. Yes, you had to clock in, but it was more of a family, and you could get to know everybody in Home Park, but you couldn't actually, because I did actually go to work at Home Park later. And each mill, absolutely Croxley and Ash, Home Park, they had their own culture. There was, you know, I mean, we're all one big family, Dickinson's, but each mill was slightly different in the way it went about things, you know. So yeah, the answer was yes and no. When you met up with people from the other mills, certainly in the fire brigade, you know, you met them at the tournaments, you know, you all felt, oh, we're all Dickinsons, but there was this rivalry, you know.
What was, did you grow up in Hemel Hempstead?
No, I mean, I was born I was born in Hemel Hempstead. I was born at the hospital in 1942, and, you know, and then lived at the cottage. And then I was married in '67. We lived there for a year. And then we were offered a flat in Hemel Hempstead, which we took. And we got that flat by reason of me working at Hempstead Mills. Back then, you see, you could go on the housing list of wherever you worked. I mean, if somebody lived in Kings Langley and worked in Watford, they could probably go on Watford you know, housing list. And that's how we got the flat in Highfield.
And how was the area different at that time? the local towns? Is it a different feature?
Well, by the time I moved to Hemel, the new town was built and pretty well established. I mean, I can remember though Marlowe's, for instance, before that was redeveloped. I can remember it as it was. But I suppose it's not that much different from when I moved. When I moved in 68, sorry, it's not that much different. There's been some more houses built and various changes, but it doesn't feel that much different. So I've not come far in nearly 70 years. I've only moved like 3.5 miles, so I'm not that mobile. But I wouldn't have it any other way.
Could you describe some of your earliest memories? I quite enjoyed reading about some of the things you remembered as you were little.
Oh, well, yes. Life at the cottage, yeah. I mean, I was born in 42, and one of the clearest early memory, is of the VE celebrations, because although there's housing there now, there was a field between the cottages and the mill, which was owned by Dickinson's, and it was Kings Langley Football Club used the field. That's where they played football then, and for many years. And there was a VE celebration, big bonfire. And two things I recall is being there with my dad and saying they threw an effigy on, and I said, "Who's that?" And he said, "Hitler." I can remember that. And the other thing I can remember is going up to they had a party at the mill, in the works canteen, and there was one of these lift up tops on the counter, where you lift up, and I can remember I could walk under that. I was 3 years old, and I can remember walking under that countertop and going behind the counter. I do, but that's the two clearest memories. But that latter part of the war. My mum and dad would sleep downstairs, and I can just about remember this, sleeping downstairs. It's not that clear, but sometimes with very early memories, you're not entirely sure whether it's because your mother had said it and that's why you can remember it, or whether you can actually remember it, accurately. But that's one of the things I recall, from early on, and other things just sort of blend in. I remember an alarm clock that was it was a sort of wartime issue. If you could only, during the war, you could only get an alarm clock because of shortage of materials and components. You could only get buy an alarm clock if you had a chit from your employer to take to the jewellers or watchmakers, to say that you were a shift worker and you needed an alarm clock. And I remember this alarm clock in my mum and dad's bedroom, and it got something on it, something like War Department or some such thing. So obviously that was one that he'd got by having to produce a chit from Dickinson's to say that he needed one. It's another sort of little thing I can recall. But yeah, I mean, growing up in that little community, going off to school at Kings Langley, walking to school, coming home for lunch, I'm defined, and my family are defined as working class. So to my understanding, because we had midday dinner. Well, I say midday, it's 12:30. The lunch break for the day workers at the mill was 12:30 till 1:15, 45 minutes. So pretty much all of us in the cottages had a midday dinner, and then subsequently a high tea, a salad or something like that, and then a supper about 10 o'clock. So that defines us. So I've read, that if you have evening meal, then that defined you as probably middle class. But anyway, so used to walk home from school. I started having school dinners, but they were pretty much rubbish. So my mum said, "Well, walk home to dinner," So that's what I did for all the rest of my time at school. And my dad would walk down from the mill. He'd be home before I got in. Dinner would be on the table. He'd eat his dinner, dessert, and then he'd sit down in the armchair and doze off for 15 minutes or so until it was time to walk back to the mill.
What were the working conditions like at these mills?
That's an interesting question. Depends what department you were in. My father suffered all his life from what would be termed today as industrial bronchitis. Home Park, from the late 1800s, was a paper converting mill. They'd stopped making paper, and they produced fine art and chromo papers, which were coated with casein, which is a milk product, and china clay and other things as well. And if you worked in the coating department, as my grandfather did, you know you're working with all this stuff, and it's quite messy, and you probably not very nice. I've got a photograph at home, and it's pretty messy. But my father was in the finishing, and of course the paper with this coating on it, when it was trimmed on the cutters and cut on the guillotine, produced dust, and the doctor said that was the cause of his bronchitis. And you say he suffered with that, but obviously it was worse in the winter. Living near the canal, where you would get a lot of fog and mist, and in coal fires, no central heating, didn't help. Other people who worked at Home Park, particularly those who worked in the colour coating and colour mixing, some of them suffered an industrial eczema. And I remember my mother telling me that a number of people that she'd known, who worked there, who actually lost the sight of an eye over the eczema, which spread to the eye. So it very much depended where, what department you're in as to the working conditions. Today, those conditions wouldn't be accepted, and the safety laws, would compel something to be done about it, But on the other hand, if you balance the working conditions against the job security, which there doesn't seem to be much of today, I've sort of posed the question, would you exchange, those poor working conditions for the better conditions for today, but at the same time going to accept the job insecurity, or the degree of job insecurity which there is today? It's an interesting point, And of course, for those who lived in the cottages, no worries about when you retired, where you were going to live. You could live there till you died. So it's all a balance, isn't it? It's a trade-off, I suppose, You could put it like that.
Oh, fantastic, yeah. Possibly a couple more questions we could ask, but that's all really good, actually.
Yeah, I should say, I worked in the book department for 9 years, and in the end I was so fed up with it, I needed to move. I tried to move to other departments, and actually they'd stop that. It was very difficult to transfer from one department to another, Each department was run on its own budget. So if you take you had card department, book department, stationery department, envelope department, they were all run kind of individually under the umbrella of Apsley Mills. It was difficult to move. So in the end I left the firm, and I moved around. I didn't settle. I couldn't settle, and I was contacted by one of the firemen, a full-time fireman, and said, would you like to come back on the full-time fire brigade at Apsley? And so that's what I did. Came back. And I did about 3.5 years. In that time I got married, and shift working and various other reasons. I moved on and went back into my core trade, in print finishing. That worked out up to a point, but then there was a drop in earnings for various reasons at the place I was working. And Home Park were advertising, so I went along to Home Park, and they knew me, took me on, and within about 6 months, I was invited to join the fire brigade there. And needless to say, I snatched their hand off, you know, and took that opportunity. We had a lot of success in the tournaments, and the chief officer retired, and they merged the job with the safety officer, and I applied for that and got the job. And I thought, well, you know, I'm home and dry here, you know. This is 2 years later, the mill closed. so that was the end of my time in Dickinson's, you know. And they, you know, subsequently Croxley closed, Apsley was slimmed down, the other factories were closed, and then Dickinson's empire was broken up around about 1990. I was just glad I was part of it, really, you know. But, you know, at the time you never thought it would ever disappear. You know, such a big part of the locality. You know.
Do you remember any call-outs as a fireman? Do you remember some of the things you had to do?
We had a couple of call-outs when I was at Apsley. Unfortunately, the big one, which was a call to Nash Mills, because I didn't live at Apsley, I wasn't on call 24/7. You see, I was still living at the time living with my parents, so I didn't get called out to that. We had a couple of incidents at home park, but an industrial fireman, an industrial fire brigade, your main task is fire prevention. The focus is on fire prevention, and that's the reason why we entered all the tournaments, because it was the drills and the tournaments that was the glue that held the team together. You know, otherwise I think, you know, well, you wouldn't have been proficient if there was a fire. You know, not like a local authority brigade is called out maybe 2, 3, 4 times a day. So you know, you had to have the tournaments and the drills to be efficient and fast in handling the equipment.
Do you still keep in touch with any of the firemen you worked with?
Well, yes. I mean, the Heritage Fire Brigade here at Frogmore, with which I'm a member. I mean, that's part of what we're doing. We're almost to a man ex-Dickinson firemen. We have a couple of members from Leighton Buzzard Fire Brigade, and there's a couple of members who were in Frogmore Mill Fire Brigade, but they are not particularly active for various reasons. You know? So we usually see them at our annual social. You know. So yes, we are in touch, thankfully, and that's, you know, that's a good thing. I mean, little did we think that we'd be able to recapture this comradeship, you know, at this time of our lives, you know, after the closure of the mills. But there, the opportunity came, and we grabbed it, and it keeps us together, and it helps keep the fire equipment, you know, the vintage equipment here on the go. So yeah, it's good.